Okay, so the topic of the discussion is I think, therefore I feel. It's obviously a spin-off of the famous statement of I think, therefore I am. But what I'm here to discuss is a perspective on emotions and emotional stability from a Torah perspective, with hints in what we would call modern psychology. But obviously the modern psychology aspect is adjunct to anything which we describe from a Torah value system. And so, one qualification I want to give is that I am not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I don't write prescriptions, and I don't have any suggestions if anything serious comes up. What I can say is that this is a subject which I am personally very interested in, and I have spent many a time reading a lot of different books on the subject and studying a lot of the subjects related to this matter. So view this as a spillover of my personal interests and hobbies that might be of benefit to anybody else. Okay, and as well, what I'm describing here, I don't think will apply as readily to people with extreme emotional disorders or challenges. Obviously, a person should see somebody more professional about that. What we're going to describe are scenarios that can apply to the common person and the average person, and many of us, even though we may consider ourselves average, do feel that we are extremes often in our emotions. And so how can we appreciate that? So the question we start with is really, how do we understand the ability for us to control our emotions from a Torah perspective? And really the challenge we have is that our life is basically made up of events and how we interact with those events and how we react to them. And so our emotional response very much is related to our common day life. Whether it be how I'm running late in the morning and I'm getting frustrated because I don't have everything in order, or I'm getting frustrated with a person that is in my life, or I'm frustrated with myself, or even at times if I'm frustrated with my spirituality and my self-growth, or even with God. And really, I just tried to throw a list of emotions that a person might feel on even a regular basis as love, fear, anger, happiness, sadness, jealousy, arrogance, guilt, shame, frustration, anxiety, worry, inadequacy, loneliness, hopelessness, and I'm sure if I asked the room, we could come up with another 500. And so, when we're talking about these emotions, how is it that the Torah, in its mitzvos, requires from us obligations which are dependent on our emotions? What I mean to say is that there are commandments that tell us to be happy. There are times when we're told to be sad. There are mitzvahs which tell us to love, and there are mitzvahs that tell us to hate. All of the mitzvahs in the Torah, which are commandments upon my emotions, on how I'm supposed to react, don't get angry. The question really is, how do I adjust my emotional reaction to the world when I am a subject of these circumstances? When something happens and I react, how can the Torah tell me not to feel this emotion? It's inevitable, right? I like a certain car, or actually I like a certain outfit, right? And I really want it. And then it happens to be that my neighbor buys the exact same outfit. And I look at that outfit and I'm like, oh man, I have a feeling of jealousy, upset. So how does the Torah say don't feel that emotion? How does the Torah say don't be upset at somebody who wrongs you? And so the question really is how does the Torah expect of us to be in control of our emotional lives when really emotions are reflections of realities and how we relate to the world around us? And it almost seems like we don't have much of a say in how that plays out. And so just to prove the fact that we are obligated, the Chinuch, who is one of the early Achronim, he writes, and I'll translate, he says, "V'al tetama lomar v'ich yia b'yado shel adam limno levavo me'ataivos el otzer kol kli chemda sheyira b'rshus chavero." How can the Torah command of a person not to desire the objects that another person has? V'hu michlam reik v'reikam. And he himself is empty, he has nothing. And all the things he dreams about, he sees that his neighbor pulls up with that nice car. How can you tell a person not to feel that emotion? How can the Torah create an obligation upon something which is almost impossible for me as a person to be able to be in control of? So he says, Shezeh hadavar einochem. This is not true. Va'al yomarato. V'lo yomarato zulot tipshim harayim v'achotim b'nafshosam. Very strong words. And he says it's only foolish people. I'm translating nicely. It's only the foolish people that would ever think like this. Rather, he says, Ki ha'amnam biyad ha'adam lemanea atzmo machshavosa mitavosa mikol mashi yirtzeh ubershusa ubedaita laharchik ulakar v'chavtza b'chol advarim kirtzono. He says a person has the control and the ability to overcome any circumstance, any emotion. No matter what it is, no matter how upset or frustrated I am with that person, or with that thing, or that event, a person has the ability to overcome that scenario. And the question is how? And how do we do that? Common thinking in the world today, if anyone was reading up on the news, recently there was a case about I think it was a 17-year-old boy, who he was driving drunk, it was in Texas. He actually killed 4 people. And when they came to court, his lawyer argued on his behalf that this boy suffers from affluenza. And because he suffers from affluenza, he should not have to go life in prison, and therefore it should be prison with bail. And basically they were able to change the sentence. And what they argued is affluenza is actually a funny term. Affluenza is from the word affluence. And what they argued is that this boy grew up in an environment which was so affluent that he was never taught the consequences of his actions. And therefore, because he was brought up in an environment which is a consequence of the situations and circumstances in his life, and he didn't know that when you drive fast, you might kill someone, and since he wasn't aware of that reality, therefore we shouldn't penalize him. And thus was accepted in a court of law. Now, I'm just trying to bring this out as an extreme, but you can appreciate at least where the concept is coming from, that if a person is a subject of his environment, or of his genetic makeup, then how can you hold a person responsible? It's obviously not in view of the Torah, but I'm speaking that in contrast. So let's get to the approach. So if you look in the Bali Musar, the great thinkers of our time, they actually give us a formula to understanding how we overcome our emotional challenges, inadequacies, and they describe it in 2 terms, which many of us may have heard. They say that there's a concept of being kvishat hayetzer, and they also talk about tikkun hayetzer. So I'll translate. Kvishat hayetzer means I overcome my desire. I have anger, I learn to overcome that emotion. I'm overcome with jealousy, I overcome that. I'm frustrated, I overcome that emotion. Kvisha is like when you go to war, you're kovesh, you capture. So the standard approach which we all relate to life and our emotions is that we're kovish those circumstances. I get upset at somebody, I'm getting upset at the kids, I'm about to throw the spoon across the kitchen, and not the right thing to do, right? And so I overcome that. I'm kovesh as yetzer. That's the kvishat yetzer. And then there's something which we call tikkun hayetzer, which means a person can come to a point where he's mitaken. He completely fixes this inner desire that he doesn't even have it anymore. So these are the 2 descriptions which are given in the Bali Musar. The Mesilat Yesharim also describes them. He describes one of them as zehirut, or zehirus, and nikius. Zehirus means I try to avoid or overcome. Nikius means I cleanse myself from this temptation at all. So I want to break down each category so that we can appreciate the application. So most of us, in our life, we are taught and we work in the mode of kvisha, of overcoming the emotion. We have a difficult emotional circumstance, I control myself, and I don't overreact. Now, the challenge with that is that it's very difficult to do that. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, it says, Ezehu givor. Anybody know the end of that sentence? Hakovesh es yitzro. Who is a gibor? A strong person. A gibor, when the Torah is describing a gibor, it's talking about the ultimate of strength. Who is that? That's a person who overcomes his yetzer, his desire. So, if you talk about kvisha, that a person is always approaching his life and his circumstances, his challenges, in the model of overcoming, it's a very difficult task. And you must be a constant gibor to be able to do that. I think I've talked about this once, is that there's a psychological barrier to doing that as well. When a person forces themselves to do something, then, like for example, how many times have you been angry at somebody, or upset at somebody, or about a circumstance, and then you tell yourself, I really shouldn't be angry right now? What happens? You actually become more angry. Like, I can't get upset at this. And you get more upset at this. It's like the more you try to control yourself, the should statement is almost like a catalyst to become more upset, because we don't like to be controlled, even by ourselves. So when I try to force myself not to be jealous, not to be emotional, not to be frustrated, there's an automatic reaction which almost makes it doubly as difficult. In psychology, they call this the ironic process. We can test everyone in this room, social psychology test. If I were to tell everybody in this room, do not think about a white polar bear for the next 10 seconds. Don't think about it, okay? I'll give everybody 10 seconds. Okay? Go. Okay, we'll stop at 5 seconds. But what's funny is that you'll find that you'll actually think about a white polar bear a lot more. You're trying to force the thought out of your mind. And that's called the ironic process. They actually found that people will think about a white polar bear even more when they're told not to think about a white polar bear than when they're actually told to think about it. And that's the challenge that we're always faced. It's the same thing when a person is davening and they get a thought in their mind. How many times have you tried to fight that thought out of your mind only to find yourself at the end of the Shemona Esrei thinking like, where was I? Just trying to get this thought out of my head, right? So the more we try to force things, we find that it actually fights back. And so if we are always going to be in this model of kvishat hayetzer, that we're always trying to overcome our emotional challenges, then we're in for a real fight. Now, is there a different approach that the Torah can suggest to us that can make it a little bit easier? And the answer is yes. So let's get into that. So the next point is, what is tikkun hayetzer? We talked about kvishat hayetzer. What is tikkun hayetzer? Tikkun hayetzer means I come to a point where I see a circumstance which normally would make me upset, and I don't get upset. I don't get upset. I don't get frustrated. I don't become upset. I don't get jealous. I don't become overly excited. I don't become too sad. How does a person come to a point where they don't react to the circumstances in their life? And so, if I were to just give an example, imagine it's in the morning, right? And you're walking in your room and you stub your toe really hard against the edge of your bed. You feel the pain. It's a reaction to something that happens to me. How can you tell a person don't feel the pain? You can tell a person control yourself, try not to get wild and get upset and start screaming, but how can you say don't feel the pain? There was an event that took place, I feel an emotional reaction to it, the pain, so I have that pain. How can it come to a point where Chazal are telling us, or the Rabbi is telling us, that you could come to a point where you don't feel that emotional reaction to life? And here is a very interesting realization. And I'll start with some research that was done. There's a fascinating book called The How of Happiness by, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Sonia Lubomirsky or something like that. And in this book, she goes through a lot of research which tries to explain what is it about a person's life that makes up their ability to be content. Which means, what's the makeup? I wrote it over here. What are the sources of our emotional tendencies in life? And I'll explain what I mean. Right? So what we do know is that part of the way we react to the world is what our parents were like. So the genetic disposition of my mother, if she was a very, very worried type of person, so that might trickle over into me. If she was a very anxiety type of person, I might have it. If they were angry type of person or very calm type of person, right? You can also sometimes see in families the breakdown of parents in their kids because there is a genetic overlay which happens, which takes place. Incidentally, the Rabbi himself says that there's a genetic makeup in terms of my emotional status. And he says like this. He says, Yesh mehen deos shebetivo shel adam. I'm sorry. Yesh mehen deos shehein la adam mitchilas briyaso lefi teva gufo. A person can be born with an innate tendency to become angry, sad, upset, all of the things that I described earlier. So that there is a component of a person which is an outgrowth of who you are. Then there's going to be the component which we'll call circumstance. Which means the circumstance of my life also is going to affect my life satisfaction. What would be examples of that? How much I make and my income. What kind of house I live in. What's my relationship with my spouse, with my children. My job. Do I like my coworkers? These are what we call the circumstances of our life. Those also affect our emotional well-being. And what they did in this research was fascinating. They wanted to break down in our life how much of these different attributes consist of the whole pie of our lives. And what they found is really remarkable. They found that about 50% of how we react to the world is genetic. Right? So the way I'm born, like the Rambam says, it will represent about 50% of how I react to the world. Now, how much do we say is attributed to circumstance then? We would normally think it should be the other 50%. And what they found is that it's actually only 10%. Which means only 10% of my life satisfaction emotionally is going to be dependent on the circumstances of my life. Which means to say that, again, we're not talking about people living in poverty third world countries. Assuming that we're within a society of people that have their basic needs met and that they're functioning in a healthy environment. That means that the person who's living a blue-collar job, working hours and hours a day to be able to provide for his family, and then having a person who's at the top of the food chain, making lots of money, driving the fancy cars, living in the gorgeous houses, the difference in their life satisfaction will only be a maximum of 10%. Which means that person will only be either 10% happier or 10% less happy in any given circumstance based on the environment. And that's a shocking thing. And they did this study, they did it across many different situations, that basically your income level will only guarantee you 10% more satisfaction than a person with less. And so the question is glaring. If 50% is my genetic makeup, and only 10% is the circumstances of my life, what makes up the other 40% of my life? What makes up that huge chunk of my life satisfaction? And the answer is very interesting. The answer is my perception of the world around me. My perception of the world around me makes up for the remaining 40% of my general life satisfaction. And what does that mean? I want to flesh this out. So, the Rambam is a great psychologist as well as a great Torah scholar. And he has a chapter which is devoted to emotions, which is called Hilchos Deos. If you open up the book, its chapter is called Hilchos Deos, and he says, Deos harba yesh l'chol echa. There are many different types of character traits of people. Some people are angry, some people are calm, and he goes through a whole list of what we consider midos. What's very fascinating is that the Rambam, if I were to ask you, what would you title the chapter of your book which talks about emotions? Anybody? In Hebrew? You'd say Hilchos Midos. That's what we call it. Does this person have good midos? Right? Is it a good shidduch? We call midos. What does the Rambam call his chapter on emotions? What does he call it? He calls it Hilchot Deot. Deos.
You think?
Now, what's the translation of the word Deot?
Like das?
Knowledge.
Das.
Opinions?
Knowledge. Das, right? Das is my mind. And this is a very strange thing. Why does the Rambam open his chapter and name the chapter which talks about emotions? He goes through every emotion you can imagine. Why does he call it thoughts? And this is a revolutionary breakthrough that only in recent history they've been able to actually realize. Is that we are emotional and we react emotionally to the world because of the way we perceive the world. We perceive the world in a certain way, and then we react emotionally to our perception of the world. Let me give you an example. Let me just tell you what I mean. Like, we often, this Revolba points this out. He says that many of us think that emotions are like senses. So, when I touch this cup, I sense the cup in my hand, and I feel that emotion of touch. When I drink, I feel it. When I smell, I have a sense of smell. Like I said, when I stub my toe on the table, I have the sense of pain as a reaction to what happened. And he says it's a big mistake when we compare our senses to our emotions. He says because senses are a direct outcome of a circumstance. I touch, I feel. I hit, I hurt. Right? I smell, I smell. But emotions are completely different. And this is the chiddush the Rambam is telling us. That in life, there are circumstances and events, and then there's my emotional reaction to that event. But these two things are not connected. There's something which takes place in between these two things, which causes my emotional outcome. So, an event takes place, I have my interpretation of that event, and hence my emotional reaction. What's the proof to that? Prove this. How many times have 5 people been exposed to the same circumstance, and each one of them has a completely different reaction? Right? You're in the office, or at home, or your kids. One kid will freak out, the other kid will just walk away as if nothing happened, but they're both experiencing the same event. That means that there must be an interpretation which takes place between these different types of personalities, which causes them to have a different emotional reaction. That's what the Rambam is telling us. The reason he entitles his chapter on midos, which is emotions, deos, which is thoughts, is because he's telling you the way you think, your perceptions of the events in your life, those are causing you to have these emotional reactions. Right? So, when we talk about the 40% of the pie, and we say it's not genetic and it's not circumstance, what consists of that remaining 40%? It's my perceptions of the events within my life. I want to give a good example of this. Nothing better than flying on a plane to Israel. And I think it was Israel years ago, and I don't remember how this flight was arranged, but I was sitting in an aisle seat, and my daughter, she was maybe 4 at the time, she was like in the window seat. And then, so the plane starts going into this like pretty heavy turbulence, and the plane starts shaking, and I noticed that the woman on the aisle, right across from me, as the plane starts to shake, and we've all seen this woman, maybe some of us are like that, she's clutching the armrest, and she's like freaking out. I was watching her, I think she was saying a prayer for the end of her life. Right now she's like freaking out, holding onto this chair, like as if this is the end of it. This is the end, it's coming, right? She's ready to say Shema Yisrael. And she's freaking out. And then I'm looking at this one, I'm like, wow, that's so interesting. And then I look to my right and I see Rachel sitting in the chair, and she's jumping out of her seat, and she's like laughing as if she's on a merry-go-round. And I'm here like, what in the world is going on here? She's having the time of her life. And this one is fearing for her life. And I recognize that exactly this point. What's the difference between those two? They're both objectively going through the same circumstance. Turbulence, which is scary, right? But how is it that my daughter is having, I could have paid her, and she would have wanted to do this, and this woman wants to get out of there. What's the difference? It's the perception. It's the perception of the event which causes the emotional reaction, which is how I interpret the world, and that's how I feel that way. And if we understand this, we've opened up a tremendous key to our emotional stability within our life. When the Balei Musar talk about Tikkun HaYetzer, that a person can come to a point where they don't have the emotional reaction at all, that means that they've been able to access that middle point, the point of process, the point of interpretation, and then they can adjust the interpretation, and boom, there's no outcome. There's no fear. There's no anxiety. There actually could be joy. So, how do we go? So, I just want to give a couple examples just so that we flesh this out. When a person feels sadness, what interpretation is going through their mind? A person has to recognize this. We have to disconnect the event from the emotion and identify what's going on in between. Sadness is a person has a belief that there was a loss or they failed to achieve a certain goal. A person feels guilt because they believe that they hurt someone or that they didn't live up to a certain moral expectation or standard. People feel angry because they believe that they're being treated unfairly or being taken advantage of. People worry because they believe, I'm putting the word believe in there, believe that something bad is going to happen as a result of their decisions or circumstances. Loneliness because a person believes that they don't get enough love or attention. Or hopelessness because a person believes that this problem will never go away. When a person has the event, and the person has this interpretation, that's going to be the computation comes out as that emotional reaction. So, why is this such a liberating idea? This really can change a person's life. Because it changes a lot of the way we perceive the world. It takes life and it allows us to be the determining factor of how life plays out. There was it's probably not a true story, but there were 2 construction workers, and they used to go every day to work and they used to sit across the big beam, you know, the famous painting, and they open up their lunch bags. And one of the guys opens up his lunch bag and he says, "Oh man, peanut butter and jelly again." He says, "How many times can I get peanut butter and jelly?" And he looks at his friend and he says, "You know what? I get peanut butter and jelly every single day in my lunch bag, and I can't stand it anymore. I'm so frustrated with the peanut butter and jelly that if I get peanut butter and jelly one more time, I'm just going to jump right off this building." His friend's like, "Whoa." Next day comes, they're sitting up, they open up their lunch bags, he opens it up, peanut butter and jelly. He says, "Not worth living anymore," and he jumps off the building. They go to the funeral the next day, and everyone is crying. It was such a terrible tragedy. And they go over to the wife, and she's not crying. She just looks very confused. So they look at her and they say, "Aren't you upset about what has happened to your husband?" She says, "Of course I am." She says, "But why are you not crying?" She looks at the person, she says, "Because I don't understand. He made his own lunch." So, say that one over to your husbands, I like it. So, that's kind of what we do, is that we blame circumstances for the events of our life. In truth, this might be a hard thing to accept, but there's no such thing as saying, "You made me angry," or "This person made me upset." You know what really we should be saying? Such and such person did something which caused me to become upset because I interpreted that in a certain way. Because it's us who interpret the world, and therefore we have an emotional response to that situation. That was Rabbi Tursky's. Now, how powerful is this realization of understanding that your thoughts are really what are the source for your emotional life? In recent history, they came up with this concept called cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, this is such a powerful revolution in the world of psychology and therapy that they found that it's almost more, actually in certain studies, they found that it's even more powerful than people needing to take antidepressant pills. I want to read you, an excerpt from a book. It's called The Authentic Happiness by Marty Seligman. He's also a Jew. I want to read you the sentence. It says, 30 years ago, the cognitive revolution in psychology overthrew both Freud and behavioralists, at least in academia. Cognitive scientists demonstrated that thinking can be an object of science, that it is measurable, and most importantly, that it is not just a reflection of emotion or behavior. Aaron T. Beck, the leading theorist of cognitive therapy, claimed that emotion is always generated by cognition, which means my thoughts, not the other way around. The thought of danger causes anxiety. The thought of loss causes sadness. The thought of trespass causes anger. Whenever you find yourself in one of these moods, all you have to do is look carefully and you will find the train of thought that led you up to it. A massive evidence also accrued supporting this view. The thoughts of depressed individuals are dominated by negative interpretations of the past, of the future, and of their abilities, and learning to argue against these pessimistic interpretations relieves depression to just about the same extent as antidepressant drugs, with less relapse and recurrence. Individuals with panic disorder catastrophically misinterpret bodily sensations such as racing heart or shortness of breath as, I don't know how to read that word. Okay, so basically, long paragraph, everyone's falling asleep. But what you see from here is that the research is pointing out that if people were to really believe that they're in charge of how they interpret the events of their lives, they can actually completely dismiss the emotional reactions that they have to the world around them. Just to really bring this to, change your brain, change your life. Good book, right? He also talks about this, and what this researcher did is he wanted to prove this so strongly that your thoughts affect your emotions, is that he actually put MRI machines on people's brains. And what they did is that they found, I want to read you this, it says, a certain person from the National Institute of Mental Health demonstrated this phenomenon in an elegant study of brain function. He studied the activity of the brain of 10 normal women under 3 different conditions, when they were thinking happy thoughts, neutral thoughts, and sad thoughts. During the happy thoughts, the women demonstrated a cooling of the deep limbic system. During the sad thoughts, he noticed a significant increase in deep limbic system activity. Powerful evidence that your thoughts matter.
Meaning to say that they found when people think sad thoughts, part of their brain excretes a certain chemical which actually makes them physically sad. Everybody knows this is true. How many times do you get upset at somebody and then you start feeling your whole body start to tense up? But why? I'm just emotional. I'm just thinking something. But the fact is that your thought patterns affect your emotions. They affect your body. A person who's depressed can actually physically make himself weak and make himself unhappy. This is just another indication of the power of how thoughts can affect us emotionally. Now, I don't have that much more. I just want a couple more points. Is that what's amazing about this is that what we've now realized is that instead of always fighting the emotional battle here, right? When I feel upset, when I feel frustrated, when I feel sad or depressed, we fight it here in the emotional world. And when we try to fight ourselves emotionally, it doesn't work so much. It's very hard, right? It always fights back. It makes us more upset, right? It makes our telephone bills much higher because we're calling mom for so long, right? But this is a very difficult place to battle. And what they've realized, according to Chazal, is if we move the battle from here to here, guess what happens? Now I can control it. Now I can decide to change the perceptions and the assumptions that I have about the world around me. And if we have that ability, then why would we continue fighting here when we can move and shift the battle to here? Famous analogy, famous parable goes, is that there was a small village, and the only way to get to this village was through this long, crickety bridge. And it was in such bad shape that every time people crossed this bridge, very often people would fall off the bridge and hurt themselves. They'd break their legs, break their arms. It was a very, very terrible situation. So the elders of the city, they all got together. They needed to make an emergency meeting what to do about the crickety bridge. And they came up with a brilliant solution. They decided to build, right next to this bridge, a beautiful hospital for all of the people that fall off the bridge to be able to come to the hospital. Now, we would all realize how ridiculous that is. Because why would you put a hospital up when you could spend the same money and fix the bridge? The point I'm saying is, why are we fighting our emotional state of being when we can shift the battle and start challenging the thought patterns which are creating those emotions? If we knew how to do that appropriately, then we would have a whole new avenue of attack. And we could actually learn to control our situations and our reactions to the world around us. So, again, the point of this first talk, I only want to introduce the subject. I'm not giving any ways of how to do it. I'm not going to give any tricks, because that's not the point right now. The point is for us to recognize that the 40% of our lives is dependent on how we perceive and how we think about the events that take place around us. And that's a very liberating thought. And if we learn to be aware of those sensitivities, just be aware of them, that in itself can be very powerful. Because it means that when I get upset, I can stop and think, wait, what am I thinking that's making me like this? Do I feel like I'm being treated unfair and making a certain judgment about a person? Am I trying to read a person's mind and thinking, well, they acted like this because it's for sure they did this? Or this is what their intentions were? Am I making my own presumptions about the scenarios and events and making my own conclusions? That's a very liberating thought, because you can be in control of that. Now, as much as I say it's a very nice and provocative idea, it's still very challenging. I guarantee you, it's not going to be simple, because some of these assumptions and the ways we judge the world are so subtle that we almost don't realize that window which takes place in between. It's almost like an automatic. We take an event, and there's just this very sliver of a moment of our calculation of that situation, which now we have the emotional. And it's very difficult for a person to recognize that slight moment. So much so, I just wanted to give an extreme of how challenging this is that there's a really great study that was done. What they did is they took African Americans and they had them take an entry exam to a graduate program. And what they did is that there was two groups that they made do this. There was the control group, and then there was the study group. In the control group, they had these individuals take the test, and all they had to do was write at the top their name, and then they had to answer a series of 20 questions. Then they took another group of different people, but also African Americans, And they had to write their name, but they also had to point out what their race is, which means they had to write down that they are black. Remarkably, what they found is that they scored 50% lower on the tests when they had to write on the top that they are black or African American. Now, this is based on the research to help people understand the prejudice that even minority groups grow up with in our society, because they feel associated with a certain assumption of how these people are supposed to be, and therefore they react much lower in their perceptions of their tests. What's amazing is that they even went to these students that scored 50% lower, and they know it was only because they indicated that they're African American. And they asked them, they said, you know, you didn't do so well on this test. Do you think it had anything to do with the fact that I asked you to indicate at the top of your test your race? And the answer was overwhelmingly no, it had nothing to do with it. I'm just not intelligent enough to do these answers. But that was the objective truth. It was their interpretation of their abilities based on the circumstance which led to that outcome. So I'm just trying to see, look how subtle our interpretations are of the world that lead to these notions, that we're not aware of them, and they're so minute. So if this will be a 3-part series, then everyone has homework. Really. I do my homework, you have to do your homework. What I suggest is that go through this next week and try to see the emotions that you go through on a regular daily basis, and try at least once or twice to catch the interpretation that you're making which is causing it. Find that thought that's happening. I'm not saying change it. I'm not saying challenge it. I'm not saying do anything about it. Just be aware that there's a window which takes place beyond the circumstance and the event and the emotional reaction. And this is where we need to learn to grow. If we can do that, I think we can make one step ahead in life. So I just want to review what we said and then we'll end. So we started with the question that so much of our lives are dependent on control of emotion in halacha, right? How to love, how to fear, how to hate, not to have anxieties, not to be sad or depressed. How can the Torah control my emotions? If I feel a reaction to hitting my foot on something, I feel pain, how can you tell me that I am obligated to control that? And we said that there's 2 approaches. The first approach is kvisha, which means to overcome it. When we have the emotion, what we most of the time tend to do is we tell ourselves to be bigger, be stronger, go get above it, right? Sometimes when we say happy tachon, fight it, it's okay. And then we'll deal with it and we'll let the emotion dissipate. Just don't talk to that person for 24 hours and then we'll feel a little better, right? But that's in the world of kvisha. It's very challenging because only a gibor is kovesh es yitzro. And if we think we're always going to be able to fight on that level, it makes life very challenging. Then there's something called tikkun hayetzer. Tikkun hayetzer means I'm able to come to a circumstance where I don't even feel that emotional reaction. How can that happen if it's objectively the events cause me to feel a certain way? And the answer is from the Rambam. The Rambam writes that in his halahs, which talk about emotions, he entitles those chapters thoughts. Meaning to say that it's our thoughts which cause our emotional reactions to the world. It's not the equivalent of hitting my foot or smelling something that I have that emotional reaction. It's the interpretation that I have because of those events. And like we saw in the book, 50% of our life, like the Rambam says, is going to be genetic. So I have a disposition to be a pessimist. Yes, some of us are like that. But it doesn't mean that we don't have control over the remaining 40%. 10% will be circumstance, but we can overcome that if we recognize that it's our interpretations of the world around us, that the optimists and the pessimists can both have the same objective scenario take place, and one will not have that emotion, and one will. The difference is in this window in between, which is called our thoughts. If we can learn to do that, we can take the challenge from an emotional level and make it an intellectual challenge. And if we can become aware of that as a first step, then I think we'll be one step getting closer to knowing that I am in control of my life, I am in control of the scenarios, and it's my interpretations of those events. So go and try to do 1 week. And by the way, that's why the name of the title of today's talk is I Think, Therefore I Feel. That's really what it is. Because of the way I think is the way I feel. So I hope this was enlightening. It's very enlightening to me. This makes a very big difference in my life. When I'm driving home from a difficult day and I have anxiety, I actually will stop and say, okay, what am I thinking? What's going through my mind that's causing me to feel this way? And a lot of times I'm able to overcome it much more easily than if I were to just say, okay, let me just go home and have a good dinner. This is what we should work on this week, and hopefully we'll pick up next week on some more practical avenues that Chazal and some other theorists have told us on how to overcome these challenging circumstances. Okay, perfect timing.